How to avoid creating weak squares in chess. Have you ever found yourself in a chess game where your opponent seemed to effortlessly take control of key squares? One of the reasons this happens is due to weak squares. So, how can you avoid creating these vulnerabilities in your own game? Let's break it down step by step. A weak square is a square that cannot be defended by your pawns, making it an easy target for your opponent. To prevent these weak squares from appearing, maintaining a solid pawn structure is essential. Pawns control the squares diagonally in front of them. If you push your pawns too far without support, you might leave squares behind them undefended. This often creates holes on the third or fourth ranks for white and the fifth or sixth ranks for black. Another important point is to avoid pawn moves that create irreversible weaknesses. Remember, pawns cannot move backward. So, think carefully before advancing them. If a pawn move leaves a square undefended or isolates other pawns, it can become easier for your opponent to invade your position. Keeping your pawn chains intact is also vital. A pawn chain is a diagonal line of pawns that support each other. If you break this chain by moving pawns independently, you risk creating weak squares behind the chain. Preserving these chains helps maintain control over important squares. When it comes to exchanging pawns, be cautious. While exchanges can open lines, they can also create weak squares if you remove a pawn that was controlling key areas. Always evaluate whether the exchange will leave squares undefended. Coordinating your pieces to cover potential weak squares is another strategy. If a weak square appears, you can sometimes compensate by controlling it with your pieces. However, it is better to prevent the weakness in the first place through proper pawn placement. Do not forget about your bishops. Losing the bishop that guards weak squares can make it harder to defend those areas. If you have weak squares on light squares, for example, keeping your light-squared bishop is important. Using pawn breaks and advances wisely is essential. Sometimes advancing a pawn can create a weak square in your opponent's camp, but you should avoid doing this in your own position unless you have a clear plan to control the resulting weak squares. Planning ahead in the middle game is crucial. Since weak squares often become targets during this phase, think about how your pawn moves will affect square control. Avoid creating holes that your opponent's pieces can occupy permanently. In practical terms, always be aware of your pawn structure. If you notice that pushing a pawn will leave a critical square undefended, consider alternative moves or piece maneuvers to maintain control. By managing your pawns carefully, keeping chains intact, and thinking ahead, you can prevent weak squares from becoming a problem in your chess games.